Hi folks, welcome to the webinar today, Right of Way, Organizing for Equitable and Walkable Communities. We're really excited to share this webinar with you today. We're just going to wait another minute or so to let folks come in and filter through, and we'll get started in just a moment as folks come through. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, it is looking like we've got quite a few people coming through still, but we'll go ahead and get started right now. Again, thanks for joining us today for this webinar. I'm Noah, our communications manager over here at ioby. We're presenting this webinar, Right of Way, Organizing for Equitable, Walkable Communities with our friends at Island Press. And we're excited to share this presentation with you. Before we begin and turn it over to our distinguished panelists, I just wanted to go over a couple of quick logistics and how this webinar today will go. So we'll start with an introductory and framing presentation with Angie Schmidt, who's the author of Right of Way. She'll sort of frame our conversation today and set us up for a great discussion. We'll follow that with a presentation from a few ioby project leaders. Sarah Newstock will share her ioby project, Crosswalk Walk Flags, and Rachel Jefferson will share her ioby project, Come Walk With Us, Wyandotte County. And after those presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion with our panelists, moderated by Angie, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Just as a note and a reminder, you can ask your questions at any time. You don't have to wait to the last section of our presentation today. In your GoToWebinar control panel, you should have a section on the right that says questions. You can go ahead and click there and submit your questions at any time. We'll see those and pull them and share them with Angie to share with the panel. If you have any problems too, in that same panel, you should have a little section that says chat. You can go ahead and chat any one of the organizers. We can go ahead and see if we can resolve any issues for you then too. I just wanted to share too, we'll share a brief webinar a brief survey at the end of this webinar. I hope you'll fill that out. We are presenting lots of webinars this coming year. We do a couple in partnership with Island Press too that we're excited about. And we'd love to continue to improve and to share great content with you. So please fill those out. And just a quick note too that this webinar will be recorded. So if you have to leave at any point, or if you'd like to share this webinar with your colleagues, you can expect to see this recording tomorrow in your email. So, oops. Just wanted to share a little bit about ioby before we get started. ioby is a crowdfunding website. We're at ioby.org, but we're much more than that. We offer crowdfunding coaching, fiscal sponsorship, and all kinds of different resources like this webinar, toolkits, and other sorts of pieces of content to help neighbors like you crowdfund and become powerful citizen leaders wherever you are, to plan, fund, and make positive change in your communities. We work with neighborhoods all across America, and if you're interested in starting a project, you can share it with us at ioby.org. And there's the link for you there. And a little bit about our partners at Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. They were founded in 1984 with the mission to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment. They elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on crucial issues, and focus attention on the sustainable solutions, kind of like we're doing today. And we're excited to share too that Island Press is offering a special discount on Angie's book today. To all attendees. You can get 30% off using the coupon code webinar at islandpress.org if you're interested in purchasing that book. And you can purchase the book at islandpress.org as well. And there's the book for you. It's Right of Way by our Angie Schmidt, who will be moderating today. Which is a great transition because I'd love to introduce you to Angie Schmidt. She's one of the country's best known writers and experts on the topic of sustainable transportation. She was a longtime editor at Streets Blog, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bicycling, Good, Landscape Architecture Magazine, and a host of other publications. She's the founder and principal at 3MPH Planning and Consulting, which is a small firm focused on pedestrian safety. She lives in Cleveland with her husband and 2 children. And, I'd love to share a little bit about our panelists today too. We have Sarah Newstock, who is a grant writer in special projects for the Libertas School of Memphis, which is an incredible public Montessori elementary school that her 2 children attend. Previously, she served as the program director of Livable Memphis, advocating for increased citizen input in planning and development decisions for public policies that reduce urban sprawl and increase reinvestment in existing neighborhoods for a safe, accessible public and active transit. She's run a couple of projects with us at ioby, including the one that she'll be sharing with us today, Crosswalk Flags, as well as co-organizing A New Face for an Old Broad, a temporary exhibit of innovative streetscaping and engineering that was a catalyst for Broad Avenue's renaissance in Memphis. And she spearheaded the development of Memphis Hempline Cycle Track. And her advocacy inspired the city of Memphis to embrace bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Also here today from Rachel Jefferson, who's the executive director of Groundwork Northeast Revitalization Group in Kansas City. Their local mission is to sustain and revitalize Northeast Kansas City through forward-looking and inclusive action rooted in principles of equity, community cohesion, institutional transparency, and environmental justice. Rachel currently lives and works in the northeast pocket of Kansas City, Kansas, and has come to love and appreciate the neighborhood people that have persevered in the fight to create an equitable Kansas City, Kansas for all. So I'll just go ahead and hand it over to Angie now to get us started. Angie, take it away.
Okay, yeah. So thanks for having me. I'm just trying to pull up my presentation. Here we go. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so yeah, just last month I published a book called Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And I've been traveling around the country a little bit, doing events like this, just trying to spread the word. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem and how we came to have such a high number of pedestrian deaths in the United States. Just to give a little bit of history and background, this is a photo of Cleveland, where I live, in 1930, and this is before the auto era in the United States. If you look at the photo, you can notice that there are a few cars beginning to appear on the scene. But at this time in the United States, pedestrians had full access to streets. You notice there aren't any crosswalks, and pedestrians were free to cross wherever they chose. And one thing I like to point out about this kind of image is look how relaxed pedestrians look as they cross the street. But that, even in 1930, that was sort of the beginning of the end for that kind of lifestyle in the United States. And as you can see, this is a different street, but about 15 years later, 16 years later, all that pedestrian activity on a lot of streets had been completely supplanted by vehicles. And one thing that's sort of striking about this image, I think, compared to the previous one, is just the total absence of people. So we've got to the place in the United States where pedestrians are pretty marginalized. And this is a photo, I think, or a drawing that really sort of emphasizes the dynamic pedestrian space in the United States. And that's sort of the subject of my book. This is a graph showing pedestrian deaths over time in the United States. And during the past 10 years, we've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. And that is such an unusual sort of trend in traffic safety in the United States. The typical pattern is just a gradual decline with maybe a little bit of variation. But during the last 10 years, what we've seen is really sort of unusual. And it was so unexpected that for the first few years, even a lot of experts were confused about this or thought it was just an anomaly. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about why this is occurring. And I think there's some misconceptions about this problem. I think a lot of people, when they think of pedestrians getting killed, they think of sort of this guy on the left who's very wired, and maybe he's distracted by his phone. He's crossing in a crosswalk, maybe in a major city like DC. But the reality is the people that are getting killed while walking are a little bit more like this guy on the right that's just sort of sprinting across. a very wide suburban road that doesn't have even a crosswalk. So I think the way that this issue is viewed in the United States, or has been viewed or presented, is informed a lot by sort of privilege. And I think a lot of people that are more privileged just never find themselves sort of in this position of this guy on the right. And so their view of the problem maybe is based more on anecdotal things they see while driving, and maybe that's more like this guy on the left. That's what they see. But the reality is there's a lot of disparities in our society that show up in this problem. And here's a graph by Smart Growth America, and it shows that there's a racial element, just a little bit like Corona, that would seem to affect people evenly. This is a problem where race and racism show up really clearly. Black folks are about 1.74 times more likely to be killed while walking in the United States. Hispanic people are at increased risk as well, and Native folks almost 5 times the risk of the average person in the United States. Another group that's really at risk is elderly folks. Those who are 75 or older are about twice as likely to be killed as the average person in the United States. And this is one thing that's important to note about this problem. This is a demographic group that's the fastest growing in the United States. So part of the reason we've seen this big increase in pedestrian deaths is explained by this alone. As these groups have gotten bigger, our planning really has not catered to older folks, especially our transportation planning. And that helps explain why we're seeing this increase in deaths. And a little bit about geographically, I want to talk a little bit about where this occurs. So we talked a little bit about who's getting killed, but the most dangerous region of the United States for walkers is the Southeast. This is a map that shows the 10 most dangerous states. They're all in the Southeast except for Delaware here. And then the safest places shown here in green tend to be in the Northeast and the Midwest. And the reason for that is that the southeast portion of the United States developed later in time. Like the image I showed at the beginning of Cleveland in 1930, some of these cities in the Northeast and the Midwest were pretty far developed. A lot of the built environment and the streets were already built at that time prior to cars sort of taking over. And then by 1946, when you see streets become much more car-centric, those are the periods where we've seen more growth since that time in this region of the country. And places like Florida have seen tremendous growth since the 1930s, Arizona. And these places tend to have a more suburban sort of street design and built environment, and those places are very dangerous for walkers. Another thing I just want to note really quickly, again, these are some of the fastest growing areas of the United States as well. So this sort of pattern you see here also helps explain why pedestrian deaths have been increasing. So I talked about a little bit about how racism and race factor into this. And this is a map of Cleveland where I live, and it shows racial segregation. This is concentrations of Black people in the green area, and then orange shows basically white areas of white segregation, and then yellow shows areas that are more integrated. There's a third sort of demographic change going on, and that is what we call the suburbanization of poverty. And there's been a big change in who's living in the suburbs in the United States. And I think this map sort of, I'm gonna go forward about 20 years, just shows sort of some demographic changes we're seeing across the country. And this is almost universal to cities, and has continued for the last decade, even though we don't have the 2020 census data. This is both a trend for racial change in the suburbs, but also for economic change. And one of the implications for pedestrians of this trend is that there's more folks living out in more suburban areas that have a more hostile built environment for pedestrians now. And that's putting them in danger as well. And here, just to make a little bit of a comparison, there's also a little bit of, we know that there's some discrimination in how resources are dispersed. safety, resources, infrastructure. If you look at racial segregation in Cleveland, and then you go ahead to see, this is a map of the most dangerous street segments in the city. I just wanted to point out how closely they match up with racial segregation. So it's a big racial equity issue. And then we see this in all kinds of cities across the country. Just another example real quickly, here's Portland. And they produced this map showing the names of folks who were killed in traffic. And I think it's pretty obvious from the graphic that there's this concentration over here. And this is East Portland. And East Portland is more diverse and lower income than the rest of the city. And you can see how this is traffic deaths in general are concentrated on this side of the city. About 50% of traffic fatalities in Portland occur in East Portland, even though only about a quarter of the population lives in that area. And just to tie it back to street infrastructure, this is another map produced by the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and it shows the 30 most dangerous intersections in the city. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. Okay, so moving ahead, we have these demographic changes that are influencing the problem, and there's a third thing that's going on, and that is there's been a big change in the kind of cars Americans are driving in the United States, and that's something I talk a lot about in the book. If you look back to about a decade ago, when we're coming out of the recession, the vehicle mix is very different than it is today. You can see that cars, so like a sedan, a regular car, was the best-selling vehicle type. Around 2012, they were about 70% of the new vehicle sales. If you go ahead to the most recent year we have data, which I believe is 2019, that has completely reversed. Now 75% of new vehicles being sold are sedans and pickups, or I'm sorry, are crossover SUVs, or pickups. And those are a lot more dangerous to pedestrians. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So here's a couple photos where I'm using myself as scale. I'm about 5'6", so I'm about an average sized woman. And if you look where this car on the left is a Honda Civic or a Honda Accord, if you look where it would hit me sort of like in the knees or the legs. And that's compared to over here on the right, we have a Toyota 4Runner. That's a car that would hit me sort of more, as you can see, in the chest or the abdomen. And it's not ever good to get hit by a car, obviously, but getting hit in the legs is less likely to be deadly than getting hit sort of where your internal organs are. And that's what's happening to more pedestrians now. Some very good research from the Federal Highway Administration shows that when pedestrians are hit by a car, it's 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill them if they're hit with an SUV. So that major increase we've seen in SUVs is contributing to this crisis we're seeing, these rising number of deaths. Just real quickly, this is a photo I've gotten a lot of mileage out of. It shows my son when he's 4 years old standing in front of a lifted Ford F-250. Another thing that's going on at the same time is pickup trucks have gotten really enormous. And these cars, one of the downsides of that is these cars, SUVs are similar, with these very high front ends can have very large front blind zones and back rear blind zones. So this can be especially dangerous to children. So with that, I think we're going to move over to the panel discussion. I know that my presentation is a little bit of a bummer. It's a lot about the problems, but this group of folks that's speaking next are going to talk about some of the solutions and how those can be implemented in communities. So it should be really inspiring.
Thanks for that, Angie. Rachel, I wonder if you wanted to kick us off sharing about your project, and then we'll hear from Sarah right after that.
There we go. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Rachel Jefferson with the Groundwork Northeast Revitalization Group, formerly known as the Historic Northeast Midtown Association. Our project is the Come Walk With Us neighborhood walk audits. The reason why we came upon this project is because we noticed a trend in our area, which is, as Angie mentioned, diverse and also low income, has a lot of rich history, but has experienced historical disinvestment and lack investment for years, and still suffers from past and current racist policies such as redlining, etc. We noticed a trend where we were seeing infrastructure improvements, new sidewalks, streets, etc., in areas where people weren't walking, where they weren't using them. We had curb cuts that go to nowhere. And so one of the things that we heard from our community members is we want to have some ownership over how our tax dollars are spent and the improvement of our built environment. So that's the why we came together with an offshoot of the KU School of Architecture agency and the Community Health Council of Wyandotte County to create a walk audit tool that was user friendly and would be easy for neighborhood residents and other folk to be able to survey the condition of their built infrastructure. So with these walk audit tools, we looked at several different types of walk audit survey mediums and kind of distilled the best out of all of those and created maps for 5 different neighborhoods in our area that have layers of streets, curbs, sidewalks, and lighting. And then we work with those residents to train them on how to notate those maps. And then we also recruit volunteers to do a walkabout in the neighborhood to actually collect that data. And some of those volunteers in the past have been school teachers from our local high school, students from our local middle school, the neighborhood residents themselves. Basically, whoever wants to come out and help is how we get that work done. And it's usually anywhere from a 3-hour process if we have a lot of volunteers to a couple-day process, depending upon the size of the neighborhood, to get those different layers of the maps completed and filled out. Yeah, that's a great picture of our Northwest Middle School students and teachers as we did a walk audit in the OCP neighborhood. After we collect that data, we then turn it back over to the School of Architecture, who has a student who works to then populate those maps with the data we've collected. And then we come back to the neighborhoods and say, here's what we collected. Do you agree with this? Have there been any improvements since we collected this data? Perhaps you called someone and were able to get the street lights fixed, so we can notate that. And then we work with them to identify their top 3 priorities in each of those areas, like I said, streets, curbs, sidewalks, and lighting. We actually are about to start our 6th walk audit in West Height neighborhood. We hope to be able to conclude that before the end of the year, but everything's still so much up in the air with COVID. Ideally, what we like to do is take all this data information and present it to our local government, specifically our Public Works Department, to say, when you are making infrastructure improvements, you need to be using these community selected priorities and in terms of where you're placing new sidewalks or doing new streets, because these are the people obviously that are using those facilities and they know how they move about the community, right? So for instance, there was a new sidewalk that was being built to our new middle school. Public Works had planned to put that sidewalk on one street, and because of our walk audits, we were able to get it changed to a street directly south, where we learned kids were actually walking more out of the neighborhood to their school. ioby has been a great tool for us in terms of being able to crowdfund for these audits, because there is a small cost in terms of being able to hire on the architectural student to do that mapping, print the maps, supplies, what have you. So that's been really great for us, and we've been able to capture ioby dollars to fund the West Height audit as well. I think that's probably all I have, and I don't know if I have any more time left, but I think that pretty much sums up the walk audit process, the kind of on the ground work, and then where we hope to take it in terms of policy and really hoping to spread that type of process throughout Kansas City, Kansas, and the county as a tool and resource that community residents and neighborhood folks could use to survey the condition of their built environment.
Thanks, Rachel. Take it away, Sarah.
Okay, there we go. Got it? Great. Thanks for having me on. My crosswalk project was a very small project several years ago, many years ago, that just wanted to deal with an immediate issue in my own neighborhood. So I'm fortunate enough to live in the Midtown neighborhood of Memphis, right near our big city park, like the big park in the city of Memphis, kind of closest to downtown, called Overton Park. And it's home to playgrounds, the zoo, the art museum, and then adjacent to the Overton Park is also an elementary school and middle school. So there's a lot of pedestrian traffic, which is kind of unusual for our area of Memphis, but there's a lot of pedestrian traffic immediately near my house. And it was really frustrating for me as a just someone who wanted to enjoy the park pretty much across the street, that it was impossible to cross this one very busy road. And so we'd go with our children and we'd try to cross into the park to go to the zoo or wherever else we were going. And you'd have to really like wave down the traffic or stare down the traffic and yell. I sort of became like a maniac pedestrian trying to cross into our park. And every morning I would see children walking to school who were having the same issues with their parents or without their parents. So it was a very dangerous intersection, and it was an unmarked crosswalk. So at a corner where really a crosswalk should be, but the law at the time kind of designated that area as an unmarked crosswalk, which means nothing to the cars who are driving by. There's no indicator that they're supposed to stop. So I read an article about other cities that had put flags to help their pedestrians cross, which is essentially just like a bucket on one side, a bucket on the other side, some bright orange flags, and you take a flag, wave it around, stare down the car until they stop, and then you cross the street and deposit the flag in the bucket on the other side. It's a very simple, low-tech way to help get the attention of the vehicles. So I knew our other neighbors were having this problem, and then perfect strangers who were going to school or going to the park were also having this problem. Visitors to the zoo were having this problem. And on a regular basis from our house, we would hear a crash and sirens and glass shattered all over the street. So it was definitely an issue. So we kept it really simple. We wanted to raise like $500. I think initially it was maybe $250, and we increased the budget of the project to around $500 just to raise money for the flags and the buckets, and then that was it. So I just wanted to talk for a quick minute about how we did it, because I think we funded this project in just a day or two. And I did attend some of the seminars or whatever they called it that ioby has about how to be a fundraiser. So they had some of those educational tools on how to do things, and I pretty much followed the guidance that ioby provided on being a fundraiser for yourself, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to do a little project like this. And basically, we broke it down into very small, specific asks, like $25 for a bucket of flags, something that people could manage, or $2.50 for some flags. I mean, it was a very small amount of money. And then I asked people specifically who I knew to support this project. And I asked them, like, using my children, or I asked them directly. So my family, my friends, my neighbors by name, or calling out people who I knew were pedestrian advocates using social media, but naming them directly in individual messages. And so this project was funded very quickly. We just implemented the project by putting up some plastic buckets that we zipped onto the poles on the sides of the crosswalks. And then we would regularly replace any faded flags or clean out the buckets that, of course, accumulated trash from all these pedestrians, because there aren't any trash cans either on our streets. And then people started using them. It was pretty amazing. Quickly, it's not something that you need a whole lot of education about. You just pick up the flag and go. And we'd watch strangers, we'd watch people visiting the zoo, people walking their dogs use the flags, and they're kind of self-maintaining how they work. And then ultimately, when the city repaved the street, they repaved it with a crosswalk. And we also put some flags up in other crosswalks around the neighborhood, and those streets got crosswalks as well. And now it's a pretty regular thing that people are stopped. It still is a problem to get the attention of some vehicles, but it's infinitely better than it was before. That's kind of all I have.
So, okay, so I think we're going to do a little bit of a moderated discussion. So I just have a couple questions that come to mind for you guys. I guess I'll start with Sarah. One thing that sort of happened for me, and I think one of the things that inspired me to write this book and start thinking about this stuff more was just having kids and like the added stress of trying to transport kids through environments that are less than ideal. Do you think that was sort of the inspiration for you? And did you try to get the city to, I mean, in a way, it's sort of sad that people have to sort of fundraise for basic safety infrastructure. Did you try to get the city to handle it on their own? Because that's another thing I write about in the book, how the engineering profession has been a little bit hesitant to provide some of this stuff like crosswalks to folks.
That's a great question, and it's definitely something that I struggled with at the time. That these types of issues are really should not be the burden of individuals to fundraise for a little project like this, or even a big piece of infrastructure. So at the time, I was the program director for Livable Memphis, which was an organization that worked on these issues across the city. And so in some of the bigger projects that we did, which were also inspired by how difficult it was for me to get around, I think having children did make a difference for me to get the perspective of what it would be like for any child to try to cross the street with or without their parents. And I think in Memphis at the time, pedestrian deaths, we were one of the highest cities for child pedestrian deaths in the country. So this was having a direct effect on the children in our city. So we did, the culture at the time was that engineers knew what they were doing and they weren't having this conversation with citizens. Now, mind you, this is a long time ago, and I think at least in Memphis that has changed. So some of our projects, not just this crosswalk, but also some of the other projects that we fundraise on a much larger scale, also using ioby, but some of those big pieces of infrastructure that clearly citizens cannot raise the amount of money that it takes to repave a street or restripe a neighborhood or put in the curb ramps. It's just would be impossible, and it shouldn't be the burden of citizens to do that. They already pay for those services through their government. But what we did find is that citizens could go in and show what was actually possible, and that was a new thing. So on another project, we actually went and restriped a street entirely using like house paint over a weekend. And we did it with the help of some engineering students at the University of Memphis who laid out exactly what the street should be like up to code to show like it is possible. Even using the standards of engineering that we have today, we can go in and create streets that are safer for all different kinds of users. And ultimately that street has been redone, and the engineers came out and were initially kind of, they knew what was going on and they were a little bit miffed about the idea, just thought it would be temporary. But we knew that when they came out with their tape measure, it was going to meet their standards. And once they left, once that paint was kind of left on the street long enough, then it became permanent. And I think that this whole culture of what was happening at Memphis at the time, when regular citizens were taking it upon themselves to make known what they wanted out of their neighborhoods, we had a change in our city engineer that brought in someone who was, I think, our assistant engineer at the time, who was really open to having the conversation with citizens and organizations about what the streets should look like. So it was the time when there was a big shift in exactly that, like engineering, and finally getting engineers on board to say, like, this is possible. We don't have to build our streets for the best use only for vehicles. Other people are using them too.
That's awesome. Thanks. I want to ask Rachel too. So I love the work you're doing. I think that pedestrian safety audits are so underrated. That's one of my big takeaways from doing all this research about this problem. I've seen it cited that they have a 10-to-1 return on investment. And I think there's just so many missing. One of my big takeaways is that there's so many missing pieces. Like we just talked about all the problems that can cause if there's a missing crosswalk, for example, or, curb ramp. One thing I was curious about, just hearing you talk about the work you're doing in Kansas City, is how does what you're hearing from doing a really intentional grassroots project with folks that are really deeply embedded in the community, how have their recommendations differed, do you think, if you could summarize, from what you see when the DOT kind of comes in and does a really quick process where they just make maybe some guesses about what's needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a huge difference, right? One of the reasons why we started this walk audit process is because in conversations with Public Works, we asked, like, well, what are you using as in terms of like where you just when you decide you're going to invest funds, like what are your priorities, And there was some like mumbling about, safe routes to school and what have you, but in reality, they didn't have any like actual list and didn't have a process for identifying priorities, and therefore definitely didn't have any type of lens towards equity in that process, right? Where you're looking at, investing in the urban core, maybe more than suburban areas, where you're having a lot of new build and everything like that. So that was part of the impetus for doing this, was because we weren't getting a clear idea of how Public Works was, going through that process, and certainly didn't have a very clear idea of like state or federal transportation funds and how those are being funneled down through to the local entity. And so this was very much an attempt to say, well, here's a process that is scientific, right? It has been based on other best practices and audits from across the nation. However, it's not as complicated as some of those, so it's very user-friendly, which allows community to grasp onto it and utilize it in a very efficient way. So it's scientific, it involves the community, it's really their priorities, but it's also the priorities of our future, because we have kids that are doing this as well. And we're also able to capture other like problematic areas. So on those maps, if we see an area that has high dumping, we can make a note of that, right? And the intent is very much to try to push that forward as an option for a community engagement process that'll be more thorough, be more just, and be more equitable than just having like one required meeting at like 5:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, which is church night, that no one can come to, So that very much was the intent of the audit, and we're still pushing for that. And I hope that as we go to look to adopt a complete streets ordinance, this can be something that will be embedded in that process.
That's very cool. And do you think, I don't know how much you involve the DOT. Do you involve the DOT at all when you're doing this?
We have just recently started talking to the Kansas Department of Transportation, and actually it's not necessarily related to this project, but another project we're doing with air monitoring, because we are co-located, right in the middle of a highway nexus, and we do air monitoring in the community, have noticed some very high levels of diesel health pollution. And so we've been talking with them about how can we get some of those barrier walls put up around the highway to prevent that pollution from leaking off into some housing sites that are near the highway. So, I'd say we're getting, more familiar with KDOT, and actually just received a planning grant from our regional planning association that is surface transportation funds, federal funds that KDOT has control over. So we're learning about KDOT and their processes and how we can have input and feedback into what they're doing in the community.
Okay, that's it. I wondered if just like doing the process that way sort of helped the community maybe build power, because in the presentation I was talking a little bit about how different communities might have different sort of levels of power with the institutional priorities, and sometimes those can be a little bit racist. And
Yeah, they can
I
be a
don't know.
bit racist.
Yeah. So I think it's a really cool sort of approach that you're using. And
Thank you.
am I right that Kansas City recently passed a big bond measure for sidewalks and that kind of thing? Is part of your work related to helping implement
You might be
that?
thinking about Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Kansas City is a city that's split by the state line. Kansas City,
Gotcha.
Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri. And our work mostly centers in Kansas City, Kansas, although we are learning from some of the things that Kansas City, Missouri has done, especially in relation to their integrated overflow control plan. You know, stormwater, sewer issues is a big issue all over the nation. We have this aging infrastructure and a lot of stormwater pollution that happens from combined sewer systems. And they're doing some really neat work over there in terms of investing in green infrastructure projects. They're putting about $12 million into public education and outreach to work with neighborhoods around stormwater and green infrastructure installation. So that might be a part of that, but I'm not completely familiar as I don't do a lot of my work in Kansas City, Missouri.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, do we want to, I think it's about time to go with questions from the audience. Do we have questions coming in from the audience? Let me see.
I see my chat box blinking, but I can't see any of the questions.
Yeah, I don't see the questions. You might have to, you might have to handle this, Noah. I don't see any questions in the.
Sure, yeah. The questions are for you in the little chat box, but I can read some for you right now. We have one that says, how can we change vehicle safety standards to discourage larger, more dangerous vehicles? In Europe, vehicle safety readings take pedestrians and cyclists into account.
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I really wish, like I've always been really immersed in biking and walking and transit advocacy, and it sort of had not been on our radar at all, I don't think. And it took me a long time to figure out. I was reporting on this stuff day in and day out at Streets Blog, and it took me kind of a long time to figure out, hey, wait a second, we're seeing this huge increase in SUV sales, and it coincides with this big increase in pedestrian deaths, and kind of put two and two together. So I think it's been kind of like an overlooked issue. And the thing is, we do have a tool that can help us with this, and it's vehicle regulation. Like we have had vehicle regulation in the United States since the Ralph Nader era in the late 1960s. After that, they established NHTSA, and there's hundreds of pages of the vehicle regulations. Now, vehicle regulations have almost entirely been focused on protecting drivers and passengers until this point. And that's why I think a big reason why we see the split where driver deaths in the last decade have been sort of plateaued. We're not doing as well as they're doing in Western Europe or Canada, but we're not seeing a huge increase in driver deaths where we are in pedestrian and cycling deaths. So there's a famous auto safety advocate who says that pedestrian safety is the final frontier, sort of, for auto safety, and it's always been sort of underlooked because the front end of vehicles, it has a lot to do with the styling of vehicles, and that's what car companies use to sell cars, right? So they're able to charge a lot extra. It's surprising how much extra they can charge for a crossover SUV compared to the sedan it's based on, or some of these pickup trucks that are so enormous that have very large grills. They can sell those at a huge upcharge. So there hasn't been enough energy, I don't think. There hasn't been enough grassroots energy, and there hasn't been enough interest in this process of vehicle regulation, because we're talking about, sort of with a stroke of a pen, we can save potentially thousands of lives. So certain things like right now, there's technology, partially automated technology, like automatic pedestrian detection, that's starting to come standard in mostly some luxury vehicles. But there's no reason why, especially with what's going on in the United States, they couldn't insist on making it mandatory. And actually, I'll try to wrap up because I'm getting a little long-winded, but I love this stuff. And it's a great question. During the Obama administration, they had proposed rating vehicles in the United States on pedestrian safety impacts for the first time. So right now, we don't even know which vehicles are most dangerous because nobody's really testing them. Nobody's running cars into crash dummies like they do in Europe. But hopefully, if we get a new administration in, we could get that back up and running. So at least we'd have some kind of idea, and at least people purchasing cars would be informed that there was an increased risk to others.
Thanks, Angie. Let me know if you can see the chat. If not, I can go ahead and keep asking questions.
Okay. Here's another question I think that you singled out. So the question is, how do advocates answer the anti-crosswalk, usually mid-block or uncontrolled intersections concern of they give pedestrians a false sense of security and endangers them further argument? So yeah, that is something we see, and that's something I talk about a lot in the book. Historically, engineers have been sort of discouraged from adding crosswalks. If you want to hear something crazy, the actual engineering book that they use, it's called the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's used by engineers all over the country. It's the recipe book for streets. It says that they're not supposed to add a crosswalk unless 93 pedestrians, this is a crosswalk with a traffic light, I should say, unless 93 pedestrians are crossing per hour or 5 pedestrians are struck and hit in a single year at that location. So the engineering guidance is weirdly high and almost like sociopathic in my opinion. So we got to reform that. More pressure to do that would be helpful. I don't know. I would turn it over to Rachel. I want to turn it over to Rachel or Sarah. Do you run that in your own communities, and how has your relationship with engineers been? That can be a big barrier.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like anytime someone wants to put a crosswalk in, I know there's this one neighborhood, Kensington, where they have a elementary or middle school in the area, and they wanted a crosswalk, and they were like, well, we got to do a traffic study, and then if it's not enough, and then they're like, but then you guys have to pay for part of it if we, it's like, what? So kind of what Sarah was saying, passing that burden back on to residents who are already paying taxes, it seems slightly unfair, just like different sidewalk programs, like 50-50 sidewalk program, where it's like, well, you could pay 50% of the sidewalk improvement, put that on your tax bill, and then the city will pay 50%, but then you have to get everybody on your block. It just seems like there's a lot of unnecessary barriers for things that seem pretty common sense, especially when they're near a school or they're near a park. It's like, come on, this should be a crosswalk, and people are walking here, and the idea that they would wait until 5 people die from a vehicle death is just so reactive that, I think in general, we need to move from that reactive stance to a more proactive stance, not only in this type of work in the built environment, but probably across the board when we're advocating for just systems.
I think it also takes a change in culture among the drivers. So, for decades, there was not a crosswalk to be seen in all of Memphis. So people just were not used to stopping for pedestrians ever. And now over the last decade, that's slowly coming on board, and bike lanes are in, and cars are starting to see pedestrians and cyclists a little bit more. That being said, I still talk to my children and anyone else. You make eye contact with the driver, like put one leg out there, wave your arms, even with a crosswalk, with one of the bollards that's in the center lane that says it's a state law to stop for pedestrians and crosswalk. Even with those types of infrastructure in there, you still have to make yourself seen, and people are texting and driving still, so you really have to make yourself as visible as possible. And that ultimately what it takes is law enforcement to get behind the law and start giving tickets so that drivers know that they are the ones who are responsible for seeing people who are trying to cross the street. And that's a big issue, and law enforcement has to play a role in changing the culture of driving.
I've heard stories of, because they seem more than willing to ticket people who cross illegally. I had a friend who got hit because she was slightly outside the crosswalk, and when she woke up in the hospital, there was a police officer there to hand her a ticket for jaywalking. So, yeah, it's like, well, can we get that on the other side too? Like, what's the...
Yeah, I write a lot about that in my book too. It can be also The enforcement of jaywalking can be very racist also. So a lot of times jaywalking enforcement turns into police just going to black and brown neighborhoods and just handing out tickets to everyone who's basically out because a lot of the laws are very, they're overly, like in Florida, there's like 27 laws that regulate how people can walk. So pretty much anyone who's walking anywhere is violating one of the walking laws. But then at the same time, we know that yielding rates are so bad. Like yielding rates are about 16% when we look at them at uncontrolled, so at crosswalks, mid-block crosswalks, or crosswalks that don't have a signal. So it's really bad. Here's a question, and this one's for Sarah. This says, as a private citizen, and Rachel, of folks who have been part of the walk audits, have you found that you're being invited to contribute to other infrastructure improvement discussions or projects, whether that be through stakeholders or focus groups and volunteer city committees?
Well, it was also my sort of professional life, so I was attending those meetings as well, and I haven't so much anymore, but I know that people still do, and that part of our broader work was to create the kind of environment where citizens are giving input, meaningful input to those kinds of planning decisions and infrastructure decisions. But keeping the pressure on is the only way to do it. Being invited is kind of a funny way to look at it. All infrastructure and planning decisions require that citizens are giving their input. It doesn't necessarily mean that that input is being put into place. And I think Rachel can probably speak to that more directly. It's one thing to just check the box, citizen input, check the box, without actually doing the work that those citizens are asking you to do. So it's keeping the pressure on and keeping good relationships open with people who are making the decisions, and you know, insisting that your voice is heard, but also giving meaningful, direct, specific feedback. And I'm sure that's where those walk audits really come in handy. They do want that feedback ultimately, or someone in the engineering or Department of Transportation probably wants to hear some specific feedback that they can that can be useful to them. Rachel probably can speak on that more directly.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. It is about keeping, you know, the pressure on. You know, here in Kansas City, Kansas, and probably in other places where you guys work, there's a silo mentality. You know, it's this is my work, this is my lane, and I think there's, you know, prestige and ego and a lot of things wrapped up in that. So unfortunately, I think that sometimes amongst community organizations, there's less collaboration than I would like to see, but it is about making sure that you're at the table and trying to find out about those meetings, and pushing forward, you know, the wishes and desires of the community at those intersections, especially when you're dealing with like larger nonprofits who this is like their thing, right? And they think that they know how to do it and everything. You're like, wait, hold on, like you can't just like cookie cutter one process and just drop it into every community thinking that's going to work. Like you really do have to be intentional and responsive to what the community wants. Same thing with local government. I mean, it's if we're not talking to them about it, then they're not hearing it. And we're not at the point yet in our relationships where they're coming and asking for it. So it is about saying like, you guys need to hear this, and you need to be willing to shift the culture, as Sarah said before, and really look at residents as experts, right? Oftentimes they underestimate the expertise of the people living in the community for whom these improvements are. And sometimes they don't even know like what the community is. They don't drive around there. They have no idea of the relation to the parks, to the schools, or what have you, you know, and it seems kind of ludicrous at a certain point. So it's like, wait, hold on, you know, you really need to be thinking about expertise in a different way and honoring the work of these oftentimes volunteers who are doing this, like Sarah, who just volunteered her time and stuck with it. You know, I'm fortunate enough to do this work where I can get paid for it and raise funds to be able to pay other staff members to do some of this stuff. But a lot of this stuff is getting done unpaid and oftentimes unrecognized, and it just gets exhausting to constantly have to be banging down that door and saying, like, why aren't you listening to us? So I think that is part of the social justice struggle. I do think that it is about building those relationships, and as you continue to work together, as you continue to prove things that should have already been accepted, it does get a little bit easier.
Awesome. Okay. I think we have time for maybe just one more question. We'll see how this goes. So the question is, many funding decisions are made by regional planning agencies. How can community planning efforts like these gain more decision-making power to improve walkability within divested communities? And related, how do we ensure decision makers include people who are most vulnerable? It's definitely a huge problem. I mean, I think that's a big part of the problem. Like for the last 10 years, you know, there's been a lot of celebration of walkability. I mean, I think like outwardly, everyone's been singing the praises of walkability. So why have we seen this huge increase in deaths at the same time? And I think part of it was that our improvements have been really poorly targeted. And that, you know, a lot of times maybe there might be gentrification in the areas that see these kind of investments. So I don't know. I would turn. I don't know. Rachel, do you have thoughts about that, or Sarah even about the best way to go about that?
That's an interesting question. Regional planning organizations are so interesting because oftentimes they have like they're kind of beholden to the different city governments and everything. And so oftentimes the leadership on the different committees are officials from, you know, various city governments and everything like that. So this is actually right on time, this question. For us, with our local regional planning association, we are pushing them to take a more equitable approach to really investigate how white supremacy shows up in their organization. To not just say, you know, we need more diversity, but how are we making it equitable? Not just to say we want to be inclusive, but how is it just? And those are, you know, just ongoing conversations, I think, you know, and pushing them to make sure that the representation of those committees and those decision makers really reflect the people for whom those decisions are quote unquote made on behalf of. Also, I would say don't be shy. So like I said, we received a Planning Sustainable Places grant from our local regional planning authority. And that was because of our relationships that we had in place, but it was also me just asking our planning, saying, hey, we want to apply for this. We'll write the grant. You guys have to be the one to submit it. Will you do that? And luckily, because of our credibility as an organization and our relationships that we've been able to build with those different departments, they were like, yeah, that's a good bet. You guys write it, we'll submit it. And we were able to get, and actually both of the proposals that the unified government put in were the top two ranking proposals in Kansas. So, you know, it's also about making that ask as well and not being afraid, because a closed mouth doesn't get fed. So.
One thing I would add, just as an example, like where I live in Cleveland, they've been working on this a little bit at the MPO. And one of the changes they made a few years ago was that they designated certain communities like equity or disadvantaged communities. And it was basically Cleveland and East Cleveland, where there was a large population of people of color and large population in poverty. They no longer had to do a 20% match when they went to the MPO. So they could get 100, those two communities and those two communities only could get 100%. Basically, they didn't have to put up any money. And that was a big barrier for East Cleveland, because East Cleveland was in bankruptcy a few years ago, and they weren't getting money from the MPO because they didn't have the match. So all these wealthy communities that could afford to hire a full-time planner were getting more than their fair share, and this community that needed it the most was getting passed over and over again. But there's also other examples, like I know in Oakland, California, that they're talking about distributing resources, I think infrastructure resources, and it may be other areas as well, on more of a reparations-based model. So neighborhoods that were formerly red lines, or I don't know how they define them exactly, would be sort of first in line and would get more than the other neighborhoods, rather than just everyone gets equal. Okay, I'm getting the message that we got to wrap this up. It's right about 2. Thanks so much for hosting, ioby. This is wonderful and it was amazing to hear from you two women.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, ioby and Noah.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. Just wanted to share again, interested in sharing an idea with ioby, visit us at ioby/idea. And again, Island Press is offering a special discount on Angie's book today. To all attendees, you can get 30% off with the coupon code webinar at islandpress.org. We'll send you a recording of this webinar shortly, so you can view it again and share with folks. And yeah, thanks you all. Thanks Angie, Rachel, and Sarah for joining us today, and to all our attendees for coming along. Bye, y'all.
Bye.